Hello, and my name is Heather Corcoran. Welcome to my presentation on whether schools should change their start times based on teen sleep needs and habits. Jumping right in, we're going to talk about the trends that we're observing among teenage sleep patterns. Getting started here, the American Academy of Pediatrics, which I will refer to as the AAP throughout the rest of this presentation, identifies that sleep deprivation among teenagers as a serious public health issue. Studies show that the average teenager is considered chronically sleep deprived or pathologically sleepy, only obtaining about 7 hours or less of the necessary sleep that they need per night. The National Sleep Foundation conducted a recent poll and found an alarming number of students are not getting sufficient sleep, 59% specifically for sixth through eighth graders, and 87% of high schoolers are not getting adequate sleep. But probably more concerning than that is the statistic here that 71% of parents seem to think that their kids are actually getting sufficient sleep. So, what effect can sleep deprivation have on the teenage mind and body? And so, this goes way beyond just decreased academic performance. Sleepfoundation.org mentions that a lack of sleep impacts both physical health and mental well-being, and unfortunately can lead to long-term complications if not addressed. Some things that we tend to see are increases in risk-taking behaviors. These are behaviors like bullying, getting into fights, conduct issues. We also see an increase in unhealthy behaviors, and this speaks to consumption of energy drinks, smoking, drinking. We tend to see more depressive episodes among teenagers that are sleep deprived, as well as a higher associated risk of motor vehicle accidents when teenagers are out on the roads in a sleep deprived state. So, before I talk a little bit about the biology that drives the focus of this debate, I'm going to go ahead and turn over the presentation for a quick 3-minute video by Penguin Books UK on what the science says about teenage sleep patterns.
So, one of the issues with sleep and adolescence is that there is a biological shift forward in time in terms of the rhythm of sleep in teenagers. They like to start to go to bed later and wake up later. This isn't a choice for them, it's not them being difficult. It's actually genetically hardwired. It has to happen. It seems to be part of that developmental phase in life during those teenage years. And so I think there's some real difficulty. There's always some tension between sort of parents and teenagers, especially sleeping in at the weekend. And that's in part for two reasons. First, it's just, as I said, their natural biological rhythm. The second issue, though, is that we have typically lumbered teenagers with this sleep debt during the week. They're waking up too early. They would probably prefer to be waking up at 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning and start getting educated at perhaps 11 o'clock. That's their natural time to be absorbing information. But we actually ask them to wake up ever earlier. And then at the weekend, they've built up this sleep debt that they try to sleep off together with their delayed start rhythms, their circadian rhythms, which means that there is this sort of parental tension where people are pulling off the covers from teenagers at weekends saying you're wasting the day and opening up curtains. But they're simply trying to get the sleep at the time that they biologically desire. And in fact, if you look at the surveys, about 72% of parents of teenagers suspect that their teenager is getting plenty of sleep. But when you look at the actual numbers, there's only about 11% of teenagers that are getting the sleep that they need. In other words, there is a mismatch here. There is a mismatch between belief and the actual objective data of how much sleep that our teenagers are getting. And what this results in is a stigma that parents can often, understandably, but have this sort of parent-to-child transmission of sleep neglect. And so the next generation, when they, 20 or 30 years down the line, have their children, they end up feeling as though sleep is something to be embarrassed by, that it's shameful, and they pass on that same mentality. And at some point, I think we have to break that parent-to-child transmission of sleep stigma.
And so just to sum it up, the AAP talks about, there's more than one reason why teenagers are suffering from sleep deprivation. It's a complex matter, but biology plays a big key role in this issue, as you just learned. And so what he's talking about is that sleep phase or sleep-wake phase delay. And as children descend into adolescence, their bodies start to naturally progress towards going to bed later and later by up to 2 hours. And this is a gradual transition through puberty as well. And so the natural tendency for teenagers is to go to sleep sometime around 11 p.m. The issue, of course, being if a child is expected to get up in the 7 o'clock hour to be ready for school at 8, their body is still producing melatonin, and that melatonin production and sufficient sleep is being truncated by these school start times. So again, that mismatch. So moving on. Oh, sorry. Just a quick, did you know that the average start time for high schools in the United States is about 8 a.m.? We do see more than 85% of middle schools and high school classes starting before 8:30. 43% of schools, public schools throughout the nation for middle and high start sometime in that 7 o'clock hour. Generally speaking, we tend to see more schools starting between 7:45 to 8:15, but there have been other schools documented that start way sooner. The reason that this is important is because physicians have actually been pushing since 1994 for high schools to back up what we think with science in terms of when we should be starting school, and recommending that kids be going later than they have been traditionally. The AAP coming in here recommends that middle and high schoolers, because of this biology that we just talked about with the natural circadian rhythms in adolescence, say that schools should not be having classes before 8:30 in the morning. This time frame that they have chosen supports the ability for a teenager to obtain sufficient sleep. The sleep window is anywhere between 8.5 to 11 hours, but the AAP says that if we start classes no sooner than 8:30, this gives teenagers that optimal chance of obtaining that 8.5 to 9.5 hours of rest, which they need for a healthy mind and a healthy body. So, what do the studies say about schools that have adopted this change? So, the study that I want to particularly look at is this one that came out of Colorado, specifically the Cherry Creek School District in August of 2017. A 2-year longitudinal study was conducted for any student and parent that wanted to participate in all of K through 12. They were looking at the effects of changing start times on all students and what that would do for sleep duration. So they conducted a 2-year survey. The district for high school specifically pushed their start time by 70 minutes later than where they were starting. And what we found in the survey, which looked at what the students' bedtime was prior to the change, what it was after the change, when they woke up before and after the change, and then that sleep duration, and then a measure of what was called daytime sleepiness after getting sufficient or what should be sufficient sleep. They measured all of those components and found that high schoolers showed the most significant increase in their weekday sleep duration, and also a decrease in their oversleep, where they had built up that sleep debt. And this was the most statistically and clinically important information that came from this survey. The highest impact was on high schoolers, which what we found is that when the school start time pushed back by 70 minutes, yes, their bedtimes did change by 14 minutes. They were going to bed 14 minutes later, but they were waking up a whole hour later than they used to. So they were netting an extra 45 minutes per night, which came out to, on average, teenagers gaining an additional 4 hours of weekday sleep throughout this study because of this change. So then comes the question of, well, how do we make this change? So one proposal out there is to simply adjust elementary school student start times and middle and high school start times by making the swap. So what we would do is, instead of having high schoolers and middle schoolers start in that 7 o'clock hour, we would push back the elementary school students, and then we would push forward the middle and high school students, and this would hopefully resolve some of the issues we'll talk about on the next slide. But NEA today found that there is not a negative impact to elementary school children when adjusting to an earlier start time. They're not going through this circadian rhythm change, so you can back up a child's bedtime and have them wake up earlier, and it doesn't show any clinically significant impact on their sleep. In tandem with that, there was a study done out of the American Education Research Association in October of 2018. Sarah Crittenden Fuller, who's an associate professor at the University of North Carolina out of Chapel Hill, specifically says that moving elementary students to earlier start times is unlikely to harm their educational outcomes of these younger students. And that data, even though that was a completely different study, is supported by the findings of the study that we just discussed out of Colorado back in 2017. So how will this affect all students? Ideally, we have seen where changing school start times can lead to an opportunity for teenagers to gain more sleep. We have seen that it is not necessarily true, which is one of the counterpoints, that if students are given a later start time, they'll just stay up later. That's not necessarily the case. We saw in Colorado where students would typically go to bed a little bit later, but nothing significant to impair their sleep. But what we do find, there are a couple of compelling arguments. One, not all students will be impacted equally. In the disadvantaged groups, we tend to see with the different family dynamics that those students may not always get the best quality sleep. And there are a multitude of reasons for that. But one thing that comes to mind is you will have students in disadvantaged families who maybe have a single parent that works overnights, and these kids will stay up and try to be awake and available for when their parents get home and do homework at that time. And there are these factors that interfere with the ability for these children to get sleep at the same rate as other families that don't have these factors. Transportation impacts, that was the largest point of contention that was brought up in this debate. And so, again, one of the ways that some districts have looked to resolve this issue is simply swapping elementary school and middle school, high school start times. That way, they don't have to invest in more buses. They can just simply utilize the resources and the drivers that they already have and just change the schedules and stagger it a little bit. Childcare considerations is a huge one. We do know that there are many families who rely on their teenage children to watch their younger siblings. And if you are to ask elementary school students to go to school earlier, that means that there's not going to be someone there to take care of the child, which can cause an undue financial burden if the families have to seek childcare while they're waiting for their child to get out of school, their teenager specifically to get out of school. So the last thing that was mentioned was the impact on after school activities. And this is not just sports, and this is not just clubs. If teenagers are getting out of school later, this can affect their ability for gainful employment. If they're not able to meet the shift demands for the companies that are out there, they may not have as much of an opportunity to volunteer in the community as they would if they were getting out earlier. And of course, yes, if you have schools that are letting out later in one district and there are away games that are happening, or there are competitions among schools in other districts, or even if not every school in the district is on the same page, this can create some conflict of scheduling when it comes to organizing these after school debates, activities, clubs, sports events, and things of that nature. So my final thoughts on this issue is that teenage sleep patterns, we can see the biology. We know the reasons why teenagers typically struggle with getting to bed earlier, and then why we tend to see so much grogginess and negative impact on their mood, on their behaviors, and even on their academic performance when they're tired the next day. But I will say this, fixing the school start times is not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's not a Band-Aid. It can be implemented. However, it is going to require education among the parents and the educators, everybody has to be on the same page. The parents have to understand the biology of sleep. They have to understand that they need to be enforcing bedtimes. They need to make sure that proper expectations are being set around when homework should be completed, when screens should be off, when they should be the latest they should be working if they are working, the latest they should be out with friends. So there's going to be communication between the parents, the children, the physicians, the educators, members of the board, whomever all is involved in this discussion. But the first line of defense is education, getting everybody on board with the idea that we have this problem. We need to come up with creative solutions. This is one way to attack it. This solution only works as well as, can we get transportation? Are we making sure that teachers aren't assigning unnecessary homework? Are we making sure that club events and sporting events are ending with enough time for the children to go home and do what they need to do and then decompress at an appropriate time? So hopefully this information has been informative, has given you something to think about. There's multitude of reasons that are factoring into the issue of teen sleep deprivation. We know it's a complex issue. This is just one proposed solution that could, have a trickle effect and start making a change in the positive direction of seeing our teenagers get back some of that precious sleep. So thank you for your time. That was my presentation. Let me know if you have any questions.